Everyone. I kind of wanted to talk about a book that I've been thinking about pretty much nonstop for the past week and a half since I've finished it. Um, I kind of want to give you my thoughts and my impressions and maybe some tips I have for tackling this book. Um, and I kind of wanted to tell you why I love it so much. And that book is The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. Um, yeah, I mean, first off, like, just an unbelievable reading experience. Super engaging, super entertaining. It ranges from super dark and depressing to hilarious. It's super philosophical. It's Shakespearean. Um, and it really kind of changed, truthfully, kind of changed my perspective or perception rather of what I can get out of a book. I've always had books that I've really like emotionally reacted to, or felt intellectually have reacted to. But this was like this was like a super engaging um, experience. Um, so I kind of want to just talk about my thoughts about it really quick. Share some tips or some things I think might be important when starting this book, and give you my overall impressions. So let me grab my notes really quick. I'm taking a break from writing my dissertation in hopes that this will kind of cleanse my brain a little bit and help me get back to work after not thinking about science for so much. Okay. So first off, I wanted to talk about kind of tackling this book as a reading experience and what the reading experience for me was like. Um, so I think that this book is kind of it's legendary for its difficulty, right? Everyone talks about how it's one of the most difficult books ever written. I mean, there's certainly way tougher ones, but everyone talks. One of the first things that comes up when you bring up this book is just how difficult it is. Um, and I do have to agree, it is quite difficult. It's probably the most difficult book I have ever read. It took the most effort and the most thought out of any book I've ever read so far. That being said, I don't think it's as difficult as people make it out to be. I think it's a little overhyped in its difficulty. What I think is the why it has this perception is that it's often assigned as a reading a reading assignment in like a college level class or something like that, and you have to read it within like a few weeks or like maybe a month at most. And I think if you are approaching this book in that context, you have to get a lot out of the book in a little amount of time, and it will be very difficult. If you are a student in that situation, I feel for you. Luckily, I am not in that situation, and I just was able to read it in my own volition and for fun. So it is difficult, but don't let that difficulty defeat you. Just keep going with it. You'll be okay. It's not as hard as people say it is. The first two sections are very difficult, but it gets much, much easier after those first two sections. My advice to you is to take this book very, very slowly. It's like 300 pages, and it took me about a little over 2 months to get it. To get through it. I would really recommend taking your time with each page and like thinking about everything you read and writing notes and annotating. If you look at my copy here, pretty much every single page has annotations on it. And I can honestly say it really helped me digest what I was reading and get through it. I also have my journal that I was taking a bunch of notes in here, so I would just kind of at the end of like a reading session, I would kind of summarize what I read and kind of what my thoughts were of, what was going on. And that was super helpful. My next tip, other than just to take it as slow as you possibly can, like I'm telling you, like read like maybe 5, maybe 10 pages a day. There were some times you get in the groove and I read a little bit more, but usually like 5-ish pages a day is what I would go for. I think that this book, so my next tip was read this book with somebody. Like, it's a great buddy read. Someone you can discuss what you've read with, and someone whose opinions and ideas and insights you value and you respect. Someone who can maybe point out something that maybe you didn't pick up on your first read through. Because this book really rewards discussion. It really rewards, notes and external thought past what you've read. So having those ideas to flesh out with someone, super helpful. I can't overstate how helpful that was to read it with my cousin. So that's kind of like my reading tips, is take it slow and maybe read it with someone and take notes. So I kind of want to talk about the plot a little bit and, my overall thoughts of what's going on with the plot. So first, it's a story about, in its most simple sense, it is a story about the downfall of a family, the Compson family. Previously a family that had a lot of money, that mismanaged it, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but ends up losing a lot of their money and kind of falling victim to the inevitability of time and fate. And this is kind of this family's reflection, like different lenses of how people respond to this kind of inevitability of a downfall. With particular emphasis on the daughter character named Caddy. Pretty much everyone has a different dynamic with her, and you can kind of learn a lot about their characters based off their dynamic with Caddy. So there's 4 chapters in this book. It's a 300-something page book, and there's 4 chapters, so long chapters. And the first 2 sections are the ones that people refer to when they say this book is incredibly difficult. And they are they are incredibly difficult. Each chapter is told through a different lens, so a different character, except for the 4th chapter, but we'll get to that in a little bit. And they're all told from different siblings of Caddy. Which again is the daughter character. The first one is the one that I think it may be the most renowned as far as difficulty, and it's told by this character Benjy. Benjy is one of the sons in the family, and he has a very severe intellectual disability. To the point where he can't speak, he can't articulate, and he can't really interpret motives. And a lot of the times what's going on in this section is not particularly clear. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that he doesn't process time linearly. He kind of jumps all over the place. The way he experiences time is very different from how we experience time, where he will jump from timeline to timeline. Sometimes he's a little kid, sometimes he's 30 years old, and there is some implication given to you by Faulkner that he has switched timelines, but you need it takes a little bit of practice to catch up, and that's what makes it so difficult. That being said, you catch on pretty quick. I would say within the first 10-15 pages you'll understand when he's switching timelines, and luckily most of the memories are repeated. So not as in like the same sequence, but like you go back to that same time zone. So you catch on pretty quickly, and I think once you get past the first like 20 pages, you'll be okay. what I would recommend is you take a lot of time on those first 20 pages just to make sure you understand what's going on. But it does get easier as you go on. So what I really liked about this section was that Benjy, I mean, he can't really articulate like we can, so he can't really process or he can't interpret motives or reasons behind actions. He's super aware of everything that's going on. He remembers everything almost perfectly. He just can't really interpret the motives or the reasons behind a lot of it. So I think for this reason, Faulkner chose to put him first because the way other characters interact with him and respond to him is kind of like a litmus test for their morality, their character as a person. You know, it kind of leaves it up to you to judge whether or not you like this character or if you think this character is a good person or not. Because what you'll notice is there's kind of a dichotomy of people who act like Benjy isn't there and can't hear him and treat him as such, or the people who treat them as like a member of their family, you know. And the thing that's interesting, you know, because this was written in the 20s, this was written in like a really not good time for people with disabilities like Benjy, you know. But Faulkner really makes you feel the humanity of this character, you know, he's hyper aware of all the things that are going on with him, and like when injustice is done to him, like you really feel his pain. You know, he doesn't know why it's happening to him, but you can for sure tell that he's in pain. You know, and I think for this reason, like Faulkner put him first, his section first, so you get an overall idea of the quality of the character between the different people in this book. So he's kind of like a litmus test in that sense. I also really enjoyed that this section is like a puzzle. It's not a particularly difficult puzzle. Like once you have all the pieces, it's not too hard, in my opinion, to put together what's going on. And I think the hardest part is actually getting all the characters straight, because sometimes you're not sure who is who, but if you take notes and write them down, you'll get it. And I also really enjoyed, and you know, there's a limited sense of communication he can give you, Benjy, but some of the passages in here are just so creative and beautiful. So like I said, Benjy can't articulate like we can. So there's a passage where the lights are turned off, but he can feel something. Like he feels something there. And so what he says is, my eyes couldn't see it, but my hands could see it, which is like such a nice, like beautiful way of communicating that in like a, you know, not a very explicit way, you know. And it's just full of passages like that. And I just think I think it's a really like a genius section, and the fact that it was written in the 20s really blows my mind, honestly. So that's the Benjy section. I'm not going to tell you what happens in it. You should read it yourself. And so section 2 is from Quentin, who's maybe the more neurotic, anxious person in the family. And he, I'm not sure if he's the younger or older brother. I think he's the older brother of Jason. Of Quentin. Of Benjy. I apologize. And it's his kind of time at Harvard. And I think a lot of people talk about the difficulty of the first section. And I think this first section is the most legendary in terms of difficulty, because the people who try it said this isn't for me and didn't get to the second section. Because in my opinion, the second section was almost orders of magnitude more difficult than the first section. It is stream of consciousness style writing taken to an extreme. There are sentences that Quentin is thinking that like will get cut off halfway through with no indication, and he'll just get interrupted by a different thought just halfway through the sentence, and you're in a whole different situation. I mean, because that's kind of how the human mind works, right? It jumps all over the place. It's not super linear, and and Faulkner does a really great job, um, uh, you know, displaying that or communicating that. So I found this section to be uh, by far the most challenging, but also definitely the most fun to dissect, the most engaging and rewarding to get through. It's also super dark. It's like this is a really, really like fucked up section. There's themes of mental health, there's like themes of like his response to racism, like even like some incest is implied. It's really, really a hard read. Um, but that being said, there are so many things I loved about this section. The first off is it reads like poetry. It's like once you get used to it, the first 20ish pages of this section, um, it's tough. It's really tough to get through. But once you kind of get into the groove of it, it starts to read really beautifully. It's like lyrical, it's poetry, and like it's grand and biblical. It's really amazing the stuff that Faulkner gets away with um, in this section. It also with the first section is the first 20-30 pages are really difficult, but by the end of the section they flow effortlessly. They flow like water. You're so used to this person's voice that by the time you get to the end of the chapter, you're kind of like, oh, I'm not ready for this chapter to be over. I kind of want to hear more about what Benjy or Quentin has to say about something, and you ended up kind of missing them a little bit. It's really, really expertly paced. Um, but more things I enjoyed about this chapter are the interactions between Quentin and his father, or kind of his remembrance of those interactions, because his dad actually like has very like beautifully written monologues. I like when I read it, I can like really see where like Cormac McCarthy gets a lot of inspiration, especially for like characters like the Judge and Blood Meridian, where they're always doing these big like grand soliloquies and monologues and stuff. But there are like moments in this chapter where Quentin's dad is giving like this like manifesto on nihilism, like he's the most nihilistic, like nothing matters character, and a lot of this chapter is Quentin kind of responding to that notion, and like really exploring how much like that affects his worldview. And what's also interesting is the kind of the dynamism between Quentin's dad and his mom, where his mom hangs up on every small little thing, and it really affects him, makes him anxious, and gives him that anxiety. And you mix it with this extreme nihilism from his dad, and you see how it kind of like sends him into a spiral because he doesn't really know how to process a lot of what's going around him. And the best way I can kind of explain this section is like it's like you're kind of like running down a hill and you lose your footing. So like you're like running down this rolling hill, and like when you lose your footing, you have to start running faster to make sure you don't fall. But this hill is getting steeper and steeper and steeper until you get into like a full unhinged decline, because the end of this chapter is fully and like unabashedly unhinged. Like it is off the walls. He is completely losing it and spiraling out of control. But again, like the writing and like the voice in this section is like, it feels like poetry. It's like he talks about like death as a person, and like how he imagines death as a person, the way he describes like how his shadow follows him, or how the twinkling of the lights on a water look like little yellow ants crawling across the river. It's just stuff like that. It's just beautiful, and it's worth the read even if you don't understand what's going on. Um, but if you take the time, I think that if you give like adequate time to each page, you'll be okay. Um, and I really encourage because once you get past this section, it gets so much easier. Um, but yeah, so that's the second section. Probably my favorite section. Maybe the last section, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, just kind of Quentin's total decline into unhinged paranoia. Um, it's amazing. And that chapter still sticks with me. I still think about it and read some of the like the monologues from him or his dad. It's really amazing. Um, then once you finish Quentin's section, you get into section three uh, by Jason, and this is kind of like this chapter is kind of like a reward a little bit for getting through the first two sections, because it is so much easier to read. It's so much easier to read. It's night and day. It's like if you have like a second language you're barely comfortable with, it's like switching from that to your native language. Um, that being said, it speaks to the pacing of Faulkner, because you by the time you end the second section, you are exhausted. You've been grappling with these two sections. You've been trying to make sense of everything, and then you finally get to this section, and everything is straightforward and easy, and it really pays off. Yeah, but that being said, this section is about Jason, and Jason is a total bastard. Like, he is an asshole and piece of shit, not a good person. Um, and he's condescending. He's racist as fuck. He's super like cynical, but also way too full of himself. And Faulkner definitely does not want you to like this character. Like, he does not want you to leave this chapter like, oh, that guy was kind of like a cool guy. Like, no, it's very explicit. You're not supposed to like this guy. And I actually really enjoyed reading this section, even though like everything this guy does just drives you crazy. Um, because it's like the one thing that describes Jason is the word hypocrite. His hypocrisy in this section is written like with like a razor like surgical like precision. Like I literally feel like that Faulkner had a list of every condescending judgment that Jason makes, and then has another part of that list for 1-to-1 where Jason will do the exact same thing he judged someone else for, but justify it for himself. I actually think it's like a razor like surgical precision. Um, and it's like it's infuriating. It's so infuriating to read, because you get through it and you're like, dude, like, how can you be this stupid, you know? And definitely one of the big themes of this chapter is like how you kind of make excuses for yourself, and how you're not fooling really anyone, you know, and how everyone else thinks you're an asshole. Kind of like your perception of yourself versus other people's perception of you, like your perception of reality versus reality. Um, and I would just say, pay attention to the way he treats other people versus how other people treat him, and how he doesn't really deserve anything he says he works for, and just like how much pain he causes the family, even though he thinks everything revolves around him. It's really infuriating, but it's a fun read because it's easy. All the things you weren't sure about in the first two chapters kind of get confirmed, or you learn what's going on at this point. And this chapter is hilarious. It's so funny. Like Jason is just such a bad, nasty person, And one of his things is he has like this really big sense of like racial superiority, but like every like obviously it's written by like this guy who's supposed to be an asshole in the 1920s in the South, so he's like all warning, he's super racist, especially towards black people. Um, but like he has this huge sense of racial superiority and how he's like smarter or whatever. But 90 like all the people, like all the black people he talks to are all just like punking him. Like they're just so much smarter and more capable than him, and they're just and he can't even recognize it because they're just like kind of punking him like, oh yeah, go ahead Jason, no, you're the smartest. And then they just totally get one over on him because he's a total idiot and he doesn't realize, you know. But it's just full of moments like that, so it's funny in that sense. But I mean, that being said, it's like fair warning, like he says some nasty things in this chapter, and if that is something you're sensitive to, keep that in mind. It's not, I mean, he's racist obviously towards black people, but he's also super anti-Semitic. He even talks about like Italians in this chapter. So just to be warned. But you know, also keep in mind that Faulkner did not want you to think this guy was smart or relatable. um, and so the last section is the only section that's not in first person. It is the only section that's not stream of consciousness. And it reminds me of like, not that I'm like a huge art guy, but me and my cousin were talking about this. If you don't know much about art, not that I do, but if you don't know much about art and you saw like one of Picasso's super abstract paintings from like later in his life, it's very easy to look at it like, what the fuck is this? Like this is weird. Like this not supposed to be good. It's just weird, right? But then when you go and you look at his old paintings from like when he was a child and he had already mastered like the traditional techniques of painting, and he was doing these beautiful paintings as a kid, it makes you relook at the super abstract, out of control paintings with a different lens. Like, oh, okay, this guy was actually a genius who got so bored of doing things traditionally that he had to find a new way to be mentally stimulated. And that's kind of how I feel when I read this chapter, because the first 3 chapters are really difficult and really weird, and they are weird. They're really strange, but the last chapter is just crystal clear, gorgeous writing, like just prose that just flows like nothing else. It's just totally gorgeous. It's like prose porn. The whole thing is like prose porn. This is like the section that you get rewarded for putting effort into the first 3, because if you have picked up on themes, then they'll be easy to pick out in this section. But this section is kind of like a third person perspective, mostly on the character Dilsey, which is their servant, and kind of showing how much she's endured, and like how every other character has had these really unhinged and kind of breakdowns over the inevitability of their doom and of time, and how just strong and intelligent and just like the endurability of like the human spirit with this character. It's just a really gorgeous section, and the themes are in this section are kind of it all pulls the themes from the first 3 sections together and finishes it in a nice little bow. I know that famously Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner had a feud, and one of Hemingway's critiques, probably because he was just salty, but one of his critiques of Faulkner was he couldn't finish a book. He didn't know how to write a good ending. That is just not true, because I really felt like this ending was perfect almost. And this section was a perfect ending for this book. And I kind of want to read my favorite part. my favorite passage rather. There's no spoilers in it. There's a plot point, but it's not anything that's gonna ruin your experience. But here goes. The air brightened. The running shadow patches were now the upburst, and it seemed to him that the fact that the day was clearing was another cunning stroke on the part of the foe, the fresh battle towards which he was carrying ancient wounds. From time to time he passed churches, unpainted frame buildings with sheet iron steeples, surrounded by tethered teams and shabby motor cars, and it seemed to him that each of them was a picket post where the rear guards of circumstance peeped fleetingly back at him. And damn you too, he said, see if you can stop me. Thinking of himself, his file of soldiers, the manacle sheriff in the rear, dragging omnipotence down from his throne, if necessary, of the embattled legions of both hell and heaven through which he tore his way and put his hands at last on his fleeing niece. So, yeah, the writing in this section is just, it's just unbelievable. So, for my final thoughts on this book, to me, this is almost the perfect book. I've never had so much fun, deep reading and digesting a book in the way I've digested this one. And what I would say, if you're having a hard time picking up the themes, go read the Shakespeare passage that this book's got its name from, and it'll be a little bit more clear. And think about when you read this book. I mean, there's a couple of big themes, but I'll kind of like rattle off the ones that kind of like struck out to me. Was people trying to escape their fate, the duality between your will and your destiny, and kind of how you balance those two things or try to run towards one or the other. Kind of the inheritance of maybe trauma or expectations from either society or your parents or your family. But mostly I would say kind of running from your fate, accepting the inevitability of time and your downfall. Well, it doesn't have to be your downfall, but I mean, I can't really say enough about this book. I know I've been rambling for like 30 minutes. If you have, thoughts on this book, if you want to, if you didn't like this book, I would love to hear why. And if it's because you didn't if it was too much or like it was like too difficult of a book, that's fine. I totally understand. I feel like if I were like a student and I read this, I would hate it. I feel like if you didn't deep read the book, I feel like it would not be a fulfilling experience. But because I spent so much time with it and kind of like tearing apart every page, I ended up loving it. But tell me why you like this book. Tell me why you didn't like this book. Let me know what you think. If you have other books like this that you would recommend, please let me know. I mean, this is catapulted its way up into my favorite books list. So, I just feel so fulfilled from reading it. Thanks so much for watching. On a different note, I'm reading Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. That's the book I picked up since I finished this one. I'm not sure if I'll talk about it, but I'm really enjoying it so far. Wow, James Baldwin. I mean, I've watched a bunch of his his interviews and his lectures and debates, and I've read some of his nonfiction. But this is my first experience with his fiction, and it's wow, it's amazing. And it's funny because I can read the narrator's voice in his voice. But anyway, let me know what you thought of the book. Thanks so much for watching. If you did watch, feel free to leave a comment, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.